Hello, you who have been carrying so many small storms inside. Maybe you are here because work has pressed on your shoulders for too long, or because life keeps placing stones in your pockets when all you want is a little lightness. I know your mind has been restless, turning corners in the dark long after you wished it would sleep. This story is not meant to be exciting or bright. It is slow, it is quiet, and sometimes you may find it too heavy to hold on to every word. But that is the gift. Let these words drift around you like a fog you do not need to follow. Let the soft weight of each sentence press gently on your thoughts until the world outside grows softer and the hush inside grows wide enough to hold your sleep. Before we begin, make sure your volume is just enough to hear each word without straining. Let your screen fade into the dark so nothing bright pulls you back from where you need to go. Know that you do not have to remember every piece of what you hear. Your only work now is to listen, then drift, then let go. And when your mind grows tired of this small, unhurried mystery, you will slip away, and the story will keep watch until you are far, far beyond it. Sleep well, and thank you truly for letting me be here with you tonight. Some say there was once a place where the ocean swallowed secrets whole, a place where footprints vanished into shifting sand and stories drifted away like the mist at dawn. They called it Roanoke, a name carried on the wind for centuries, whispered by sailors who watched the coast appear and disappear behind a curtain of fog that seemed almost alive. Long before the name became a ghost on a map, there was a morning when a single ship creaked and moaned across the Atlantic. The men on board did not know how the shore would greet them. They only knew the taste of salt crusted on their lips, the slap of waves against worn planks, and the smell of wet rope that clung to their hands no matter how many times they washed them in the spray. They gathered on deck at dawn, eyes squinting into the gray. A pale line of sand rose slowly, like something waking up. No one spoke at first. They held their breath, listening to the flap of sails, the hush of wind slipping between ropes, the low prayer of timbers that had survived storms no one wanted to remember. Somewhere below, in a dark hold, trunks and barrels rattled with the dreams of a new world. Seeds wrapped in cloth, iron nails, cracked leather boots, letters written to no one in particular. Among them was a man named John White. Some believed he sketched the island long before he ever stepped on its shore, tracing rivers that twisted like veins and forests that loomed like a promise too big to keep. He stood at the bow that morning, one hand resting on the splintered rail, eyes wide open to the shifting coast. Perhaps, if he closed his eyes, he could see it the way it was in his mind. Neat rows of cottages, laughter carried from field to field, fences sturdy enough to hold off whatever shadows lurked just beyond the tree line. But when the anchor dropped, reality was nothing like the drawings. They waded through water that clung cold to their legs, boots sinking into sand so soft it seemed to breathe beneath them. The trees rose tall and unbothered, ancient trunks wrapped in vines that whispered secrets if you dared stand still long enough to hear them. Somewhere deeper in the woods, birds fell silent, as if they too were waiting for these strangers to decide whether they belonged. They built small shelters first, logs stripped and stacked with hands already blistered. They marked out gardens, scraped at the stubborn soil with shovels that bent under the weight of their hunger. At night, they gathered around thin fires, staring into flames that flickered and cracked like the voice of someone trying to speak, but never finishing a sentence. They could hear it sometimes, just beyond the light. The quiet footfalls, the snap of a branch, the hush of something moving where no one could see. Some said it was only the wind winding its way between trees. Others swore they saw figures standing in the fog, figures that melted away the moment they were named. And so the first nights passed in uneasy sleep. Men and women curled beneath blankets that smelled of salt and smoke, listening to waves lapping against the shore, as if the ocean itself was reminding them how far from home they really were. No one yet knew that Roanoke would hold its secret close, tighter than any map or letter could explain. But in the hush between each heartbeat, as the fire burned low and the fog slipped closer, they felt it, the promise that some places are never meant to be found once they are lost. By the time the first garden rose began to sprout, the settlers had learned to listen to the silence as much as the wind. In the distance, the ocean kept speaking in a language they could not quite understand, its waves folding and unfolding like an old letter read too many times. On certain mornings, the mist would come in early, sliding between trees and curling around rooftops until the whole settlement felt like a memory drifting out of reach. Some mornings, John White would rise before the others, slipping outside with his sketches clutched close to his chest. He would stand at the edge of the clearing, pencil hovering over paper that fluttered like a restless bird in his hands. He tried to capture the shape of the trees, the bend of the river, the outline of distant dunes, but each time his lines felt wrong, too clean, too certain for a place that refused to be held still. Behind him, the small cluster of shelters murmured with the sounds of waking, pots clanging, low voices greeting the day. The soft hush of children, still half asleep. They spoke in hushed tones about the shadows they thought they saw at dusk. The footprints that sometimes appeared just beyond the fence, half swallowed by mud and reeds before the morning sun could dry them away. At night, the stories grew. Around the fires, their voices dropped to whispers, as they wondered who else might be watching them from the woods. Some claimed to see figures moving behind the pines, tall and patient, eyes that glowed like embers when the wind shifted just right. Others dismissed it as fear playing tricks, the mind twisting branches into shoulders, mist into faces, the rustle of leaves into footsteps that never quite arrived. Still, they hammered new stakes into the ground, stretching rope from post to post as if thin lines could hold back whatever lingered in that restless forest. They hung lanterns at the edges of their camp, small flames swaying in the breeze, shadows dancing along the packed dirt pathways. It made them feel safer somehow, as if light alone could keep secrets from wandering in. Some nights, when sleep refused to come, they would sit by the dying embers, staring into the glow until it blurred into shapes they could no longer name. They thought of home then. The stone streets left behind, the laughter of neighbors they would never hear again. The way the hearth in a familiar room could make even the coldest night seem gentle. But here, in Roanoke, the night was a thing with teeth and hidden eyes, a soft lullaby wrapped in the promise that something waited, just beyond the line of lantern light. They did not yet know how many dawns they would count, or how many nights they would spend tracing ghosts they could never quite catch. So they listened. They listened to the waves, the trees, the hush of wind slipping through the cracks in their walls, and the quiet footsteps they could never follow. And in that listening, something deeper settled, a feeling that Roanoke was not just a place on a map, but a secret too big to hold in any one heart. As days slipped into weeks, the settlers began to wonder if the island itself was shifting around them, moving like a living thing that could bend paths and swallow footprints when no one was looking. They had marked trails with stones and tied strips of cloth to tree branches. Yet more than once, someone would wander a little too far for water or firewood and return wide-eyed, insisting the forest had rearranged itself while they were gone. In the early hours, before the sun lifted the fog, they could hear it, branches creaking where no wind moved, the soft thud of something dropping to the forest floor, the hush of feet brushing through undergrowth. Some blamed the local tribes who watched them from the shadows, but even the few who had glimpsed those faces, painted in earth and ash, said the forest held more than just people. When John White walked the trails, he carried with him a small piece of charcoal, blackening his fingertips as he traced rough sketches on scraps of parchment. He sketched the river's bend again and again, though each day it seemed to curve a little differently in his mind. He drew the shapes of huts, the angles of fences, the patterns of footprints half sunk in mud, trying to catch something that would not stay still. One morning, as the mist curled close to the settlement, a child's laughter rose where no child should have been. They searched for the source, behind cabins, around the edges of the garden plots, but found only damp earth and the thin smell of wood smoke clinging to empty air. When the settlers gathered that night, they spoke of it in murmurs, voices soft enough to be carried away by the wind. They told each other that fear was just another shadow, a thing to chase away with kind words and steady work. They clung to small comforts, the warmth of a neighbor's fire, the weight of a sturdy fence post driven deep into the ground, the taste of bread baked from the first meager harvest. Yet even in those moments of quiet hope, something always tugged at the edge of their thoughts, like a whisper carried from tree to tree. The lanterns flickered at the clearing's edge, their glow floating like fireflies pinned to the darkness. And beyond that fragile circle of light, the forest breathed its own slow rhythm, never fully asleep, never entirely awake. Some nights, when the moon hung heavy and low, the settlers dreamed of home. But when they woke, the trees pressed closer, the shadows lingered longer, and the hush of unseen footsteps seemed to echo in every heartbeat. They did not yet speak of leaving. They told themselves this place would bend, would yield to fence posts and gardens and the sound of children's feet running through the dirt. But somewhere deep inside, they felt it already. Roanoke was a secret that did not want to be tamed, a story that would slip through their fingers the moment they thought they understood it. So they kept their fires burning low, eyes watching the tree line where mist gathered thick as breath, ears tuned to the gentle promise that something waited out there, patient and silent, until the time came to call them deeper into the trees. In the days when the rain came down without warning, the settlers learned how thin their roofs really were. Drops of water tapped through the gaps in their thatch, falling onto sleeping faces and the rough wool blankets they pulled tight around their shoulders. Each dawn brought a new patch to mend, a new leak to find with cold fingers as mist rose from the sodden ground like breath from a restless sleeper. John White would stand under the low eaves, watching the fog slide between cabins, wrapping each one in a pale cloak that made the world seem softer, quieter. He listened to the distant hush of waves, the drip of rain from the eaves, the muffled sound of someone sobbing when they thought no one could hear. Some nights he traced each sound in his mind, like lines on a map he could never finish. Word spread that tools had gone missing. A hammer left beside a fence, a small axe that vanished from a stump near the gardens. No one claimed to have taken them, yet they were simply gone, swallowed by the dark edges of the settlement where shadows clung like damp cloth. The settlers whispered that perhaps the forest had hands, that it reached out in the dark when they slept too soundly. Once, near the edge of the clearing, a woman swore she saw a figure standing just beyond the flicker of the lanterns. She said it was neither man nor ghost, but something that felt like both, its shape shifting in and out of the drifting fog until she could not say if she had seen anything at all. Others dismissed her story with nervous laughter, yet when they walked past that spot at dusk, they found themselves glancing sideways, searching the shadows for shapes that did not belong. The garden rose grew slowly under the heavy rain, small green shoots fighting to stand against the weight of the world above them. The settlers pinned their hope to those fragile stems, tending each leaf with the same care they gave their whispered prayers. If the earth could yield its harvest, perhaps the island would accept them, shelter them, hold their secrets kindly. But the wind still carried voices some nights, voices that rose and fell like lullabies sung by no one they could name. The children would wake crying, eyes wide at dreams of footsteps that circled their beds, of soft breathing near their ears when the room was empty. Mothers hushed them back to sleep, though the chill that lingered in the corners did not leave so easily. In the hush before dawn, when the fires burned down to coals and the rain tapped gently on the roof, some settlers lay awake listening for the sound of footsteps outside their walls. They told themselves it was nothing, only the wind shifting the trees, the brush of branches across the ground. Yet deep inside, where the hush turned to a knot tight in their chests, they felt the island watching, waiting for something they could not name. And still they stayed, fires flickering in the mist, voices soft enough to be carried away by the sea breeze, dreams drifting between the living and the unseen, like a promise that Roanoke's secrets would never sleep as long as they remained. There came a morning when the air felt heavier than before, as if the mist itself had learned to listen. It gathered in the hollow places between trees, curling under the wooden eaves, drifting along the narrow paths they had worn with so many cautious footsteps. Voices softened to hushes as the settlers went about their small tasks, tending the fragile garden beds, mending fences that always seemed to sag by dawn. In the far corner of the clearing, a boy stood still beside a row of beans that clung to crooked stakes. He said he had seen someone watching him from the edge of the forest, a figure with hair the color of bark, eyes dark and patient, standing so still they might have been carved from the trunks themselves. By the time the boy called out, the figure was gone, swallowed by branches that trembled as if a breeze had passed but left no wind behind. Word spread that maybe the local tribes were near again, moving closer each night to test the fence line, to weigh these pale strangers who tried to plant their fragile hopes in this restless soil. Some settlers spoke of trading, beads for corn, cloth for meat, though no one could say for certain if they were truly welcome or merely tolerated for now. John White wrote careful notes about each glimpse and whisper, his charcoal sketches filled with shadows that never stood still long enough to draw clearly. He wondered if they were being watched only out of curiosity, or if there were older stories here, stories told by the trees and carried on the wind before any ship's mast ever touched this shore. Sometimes, when the fog lifted just enough, a figure would appear between the trees, neither near nor far, only standing, only watching. They did not speak, and the settlers, wary of breaking a fragile peace, did not shout. They left small bundles near the trail, trinkets, pieces of cloth, a handful of metal nails. In the morning, the bundles would be gone, and in their place, an ear of corn or a string of fish left behind, like a quiet promise that no one would be harmed if they remembered to tread gently. Yet even as these exchanges continued, unease curled itself around the campfires. Some nights, the settlers heard voices calling in a language they did not know, laughter that rose and fell like the sound of water slipping over stone. The children dreamed of faces painted in ochre and ash, peering through the gaps in their walls, eyes gleaming with secrets no translation could ever carry. By the time sleep came, it came thin and shallow, woven through with half-formed stories about figures in the mist. And in those fragile hours before dawn, when the forest seemed to lean closer to their small circle of warmth, the settlers felt the island breathing with them, a slow, patient rhythm that did not promise safety, only the chance to stay awake long enough to listen. And so they waited, fires burning low, eyes flickering from shadow to shadow, wondering if trust could grow in a place where secrets took root deeper than any fence they could build. Some evenings, when the sky turned the color of wet ashes and the forest edge blurred into drifting mist, a few of the settlers gathered at the same narrow trail where gifts were left. They stood with baskets balanced in their arms, small offerings of beads and cloth, watching the tree line for any sign that their quiet exchange might hold the peace for one more night. Now and then, a figure would appear, stepping out of the shadows like a thought pulled from a half-remembered dream. They did not speak in words the settlers could understand. Instead, they gestured, pointing to the baskets, to the fence, to the sky overhead, as if all three were bound together by threads only they could see. John White often watched these exchanges from a distance, sketchbook pressed to his chest, heart beating a little faster when he saw a smile break through the tension on someone's face. He imagined the fragile lines of trust being drawn in the dirt beneath their feet, lines that could be brushed away by a single heavy rain or the wrong word spoken at the wrong time. Inside the settlement, the talk grew softer whenever these quiet visitors were mentioned. Some settlers feared they would come closer than the fence, step into the gardens, stand by the fires that flickered all night long. Others wished they would, dreamed of learning the secrets of the woods, the rivers, the places where fish and game moved like breath through the trees. But trust is a thin rope to hold when hunger tugs at one end and fear at the other. On a night when the wind rose and the firelight trembled in its grasp, a small gathering of settlers and strangers met by the clearing's edge. They exchanged words they could not share, drawing symbols in the dirt with sticks and fingertips, pointing to baskets of dried corn and smoked meat. Eyes met and drifted away, not sure whether to hold or to hide. A single laugh broke the hush, the sound surprising in its warmth, rippling through the cold like a crack in ice that does not yet break. But when the settlers returned to their huts, arms filled with food they could not have found alone, they found their sleep tangled with questions. Did the forest welcome them now, or simply watch with softer eyes? Did the gifts mean peace, or only a truce made of thin mist and unspoken debts? Through the thin walls, they heard the low drum of footsteps moving beyond the fence. The mist swallowed shapes so easily that even lanterns could not hold them back. And when the dawn came, gray and heavy with promise, the baskets were empty once more, waiting to be filled again with offerings small enough to trade for a little more hope. So they whispered to each other in the hush of early light, voices careful not to wake the shadows at the door. They wondered if trust could grow like roots in rocky soil, if it would hold when the rain came, when the forest leaned closer, when the ocean rose again to remind them that Roanoke belonged to its secrets first and always. When the first leaves began to lose their green, curling at the edges like old pages left too close to the fire, the settlers felt the shift in their bones. Nights pressed in sooner, and the mist came heavier, curling around rooftops and fences, seeping into corners that once felt safe. Fires burned longer, crackling with the small comfort of warmth that never seemed to reach every shadow. In the gardens, the last shoots strained upward, thin and brittle beneath the weight of the changing sky. Children crouched low, pulling weeds with cold fingers that trembled no matter how tight they clenched their fists. Some mornings, they found deer tracks close to the rows of corn, as if the forest itself reminded them that hunger did not care whose hands had planted the seeds. John White walked the edge of the clearing more often now. His sketches turned to thin charcoal lines that blurred when the damp crept into the paper. He drew the fences, the rows of huts, the paths that wound like veins through the trees. But no matter how he pressed his pencil, the lines never stayed straight, always bending, always shifting, as if the land beneath them breathed differently each night. At the meeting place near the trail, the baskets were still left behind. Beads for corn, scraps of cloth for bundles of fish that smelled of river stones and cold streams. But the trades grew smaller, fewer gifts left in return, and sometimes nothing at all but footprints in the soft dirt, vanishing toward the trees. The settlers spoke in low voices around their fires, wondering if they had asked for too much or given too little, or if the island had simply grown tired of this fragile exchange. Inside the huts, dreams turned restless. Mothers held their children close as they drifted in and out of sleep, the walls creaking with wind that carried voices only half understood. Some dreamed of ships returning on silver waves, sails swollen with the promise of rescue, and the taste of bread that did not crumble in the hand. Others dreamed of footsteps circling the settlement at night, soft and patient, never knocking, never asking to come in. And through it all, the ocean kept its own counsel, sighing against the shore like a secret too big to name. The settlers heard it in their sleep, a slow, endless hush that reminded them how far they had come, and how far they still were from any promise of home. Yet in the pale light of dawn, they rose again, pulling thin blankets tighter around their shoulders, stepping out into gardens they hoped would hold through the cold. They patched roofs, mended fences, counted the days without counting the cost, telling each other that trust, once given, might still grow roots deep enough to hold through winter's reach. And as they worked, the mist drifted between them like an old friend they could neither keep nor send away, wrapping each word in a softness that felt almost like a lullaby, even as it promised nothing at all. As the nights grew longer and the frost began to settle on the soft earth, the settlers felt the hush of the island deepen around them, a hush so complete it sometimes pressed against their chests like an old grief they could not name. Fires crackled through the hours before dawn, their embers drifting up into the mist, carrying prayers that never seemed loud enough to reach any listening ear. The baskets at the trail's edge sat untouched more often now, their beads and scraps of cloth damp with morning dew. Some mornings, the settlers found footprints leading toward the trees, but nothing left in return. Only the hush of branches closing in behind something unseen. They told themselves the trades would begin again when the weather softened, when the forest grew generous once more. But deep inside, they felt the roots of trust grow thin beneath the weight of their hunger. Inside the huts, the nights brought strange dreams. Mothers woke to find children sitting up in the dark, eyes open wide at things they could not explain. They spoke of figures standing in doorways, voices whispering through walls too thin to hold secrets back. When the mothers shushed them to sleep again, they lay awake long after, listening for the hush of footsteps on packed dirt just beyond the fence. John White wrote by the light of a flickering candle, each line of charcoal trembling as the wind rattled the walls. He drew the clearing again and again, each hut and trail pinned like an insect beneath glass, yet every drawing felt incomplete, missing some curve of the river, some shadow at the edge of the trees that refused to hold still. He wondered if the island could ever be mapped at all, or if it would always drift just beyond reach, like mist rising from the sea. Sometimes, a single shape would appear at the edge of the clearing, half seen through the drift of fog and the slow dance of smoke. A figure watching, waiting, slipping back between trunks that swallowed them whole. Some settlers still believed these quiet visitors would return with baskets of corn and fish when the ground thawed. But others spoke in whispers that the forest was learning to close its hand around what it wanted to keep. By the fires, the settlers told stories they did not finish. They spoke of ships that might come soon, sails blooming on the horizon like flowers. In a world that still remembered spring, they imagined the creak of wooden planks, the smell of fresh bread and dry blankets, the sound of familiar voices calling their names. But each time they closed their eyes, they felt the weight of the hush settle heavier than any promise they could hold. And when the dawn came, thin and pale through the frost, they stepped into a world that seemed softer than it truly was, mist curling at their ankles like an old secret, the hush of the ocean folding into the sigh of the trees, as if the island itself was dreaming of what might come next. By the time the cold settled deep in their bones, the settlers spoke less around the fires, their voices swallowed by the crackle of damp wood and the hush of wind that slipped through every thin wall. Each night felt longer than the last, the moon hanging low like a watchful eye that saw everything they wished to keep hidden. The garden beds lay barren now, brittle stalks bending under frost that clung to every leaf. They counted their stores in whispers, sacks of grain grown thin, smoked fish that tasted of river stones and ash. They rationed each meal with the care of people who had learned how far a single bite could stretch when hope ran low. The children, once so quick to laughter, grew quiet under blankets that smelled of salt and smoke. They dreamed of warm places they barely remembered, of fires that did not burn out by dawn, of voices calling them home through walls that did not creak. Sometimes they woke crying, certain they had heard footsteps circling the huts, though the mist outside lay undisturbed, hiding what the moon chose not to show. John White kept his sketches close, pages worn soft at the edges from too many nights spent tracing lines in candlelight. He drew faces now, not just the outlines of huts and trees, but eyes half seen through drifting fog, figures leaning into the mist where the clearing ended. Some lines he erased before the dawn came, as if afraid the shapes might slip from the page into the waking world. A few men still stood watch at the fence, lanterns held high as their breath rose in clouds that vanished before they could speak. They said the forest moved at night, not with wind, but with a slow shuffle that sounded too much like footsteps to ignore. One guard swore he heard a voice whisper his name, though when he turned, there was only the hush of the trees leaning closer than before. The women gathered the children near the fire each evening, singing lullabies that drifted between the walls like threads of warmth they hoped would hold until morning. But when the wind howled against the roofs, they felt the fragile hush crack, just for a moment, enough to remind them that some secrets did not sleep, not even in the cold. And yet, as dawn crept up over the mist, they rose again. They stepped out into frost that bit at their skin, patching fences that sagged under the weight of snow, stacking what wood they had left as if each splinter might buy them another night's warmth. They told each other the ships would come soon, sails blooming like pale ghosts on the horizon, carrying words of home and hands ready to carry them back. But in the hush that wrapped the clearing, in the footprints that vanished before anyone could follow, they felt the island breathe with them, slow, patient, holding its secrets just beyond reach, waiting for the moment when even whispers would slip into silence. As the last days stretched thin and the frost refused to leave, the settlers found themselves standing longer at the edge of the clearing, eyes turned toward a horizon that gave them nothing back. They listened for the sound of sails they had dreamed into being, for the creak of wooden hulls and the call of familiar voices, but the ocean only sighed, a lullaby too old to promise anything more. Inside the huts, the fires burned low, embers blinking like tired eyes half open to the dark. Stories drifted from mouth to mouth, voices soft enough to be carried away by the hush of mist that curled beneath the doorframes. They spoke of home in words that fell like feathers, of stone streets and warm hearths, of faces that waited far across a sea that now seemed wider than any map could hold. Some nights, footsteps came closer than before, shapes moving just beyond the lantern light, too quiet to name but too near to forget. A guard, waking at dawn, found small handprints pressed into the frost by the fence, as if someone had lingered there, watching through the cold hours while the settlement slept. He traced them with a fingertip, felt the way the ice melted beneath his touch, and said nothing when he returned to the fire. John White kept his last sketches tucked away, pages smudged with lines that refused to stay straight. He wondered if the island would remember them when they were gone, if the hush of trees and waves would carry their stories long after the fences had fallen and the huts had sunk back into earth and moss. One morning, they woke to find the baskets at the trail untouched, the footprints gone as if they had never been. The forest stood silent, wrapped in mist so thick it blurred the edges of the world, a soft curtain that closed around every whispered word. They did not speak of what it meant, because some things lose their shape when spoken aloud. So they rose each day, moving through the hush as if caught in a dream they could not wake from. They tended gardens that gave nothing back, repaired fences that leaned like old bones, stared into the mist that drifted through their open hands. And when at last the footprints they left behind began to fade, when the ocean's hush grew louder than their own small voices, the island held their story the way it always had, close, quiet, hidden in roots and branches, in waves that carry secrets far from any shore. Some say if you stand at the edge of that clearing now, long after the huts have fallen and the fences have rotted into soil, you can still feel them there. A breath in the mist, a hush in the trees, a lullaby made of footsteps that never quite vanish. And if you listen closely enough, you may find that the secret does not ask to be found. It only asks to be let go, drifting like fog across the dawn, soft enough to carry you gently into sleep. My dear friends, if you are still here, eyes half closed and mind drifting just above sleep, then let me keep you close for a little while longer. This next piece belongs to our gentle series, Boring History for Sleep. Stories that hold no twists, no sharp edges, only slow moments to help you drift deeper, wrapped in the soft hush of the past. So if you wish, stay with me. Close your eyes if they are not closed already. Let your breath slow. And together we will wander into another quiet corner of this boring history for sleep, where even the simplest details are dull enough to carry you far from wakefulness. The Mary Celeste, the ghost ship that drifted empty. Some stories linger longer than any storm at sea, drifting on the tide of rumor and salt and whispered guesses that never find a harbor. Among these quiet mysteries is the name Mary Celeste, a name spoken with the hush of waves folding against an empty hull, a name that has drifted through the years like a ghost ship that no one could ever quite anchor to the truth. They called her a merchant brigantine, two masts rising like pale arms against the restless sky, sails once white now remembered only through sketches and logbooks stained by the sea. She was not built to frighten, not meant to carry a legend across centuries, yet somehow she became one, the Mary Celeste, the ship that was found drifting on the Atlantic, her sails still set, her cargo safe and dry, but her crew nowhere to be seen. Long before she earned the title of ghost ship, the Mary Celeste was given life in a shipyard in Nova Scotia, built by hands that smelled of tar and pine, and the cold wind that blows over new timber. They named her Amazon at first, a name that spoke of strength, of wide rivers and storms to be conquered. She sailed under that name until misfortune tangled itself in her rigging. Collisions, a captain lost to sickness, repairs that could never quite scrub away the bad luck that seemed to follow her wake. When new owners took her on, they gave her a new name, as if fresh paint and fresh hope could break the old curse. Mary Celeste, a name softer on the tongue, almost gentle, as if the ocean might listen kindly to such a promise. They loaded her with barrels of industrial alcohol, pointed her bow toward Europe, and set her crew and captain on a course they hoped would be smooth. But the sea, as always, keeps its secrets stitched deep beneath each rolling wave. In those first days out of port, the Mary Celeste cut through the Atlantic with sails stretched tight to the wind. She carried families, a captain, his wife, their small child, and a crew that trusted wood and canvas more than any land beneath their feet. They ate together in the dim light below deck, listening to the boards creak, to the hush of waves brushing the hull like a lullaby they all knew by heart. No one on that deck could have guessed that, just weeks later, their ship would be found drifting like a question with no answer. That the name Mary Celeste would one day carry the chill of empty cabins, bowls left half full, sails trimmed neatly for a wind that blew for no one. So here we begin, standing at the dock beside the ghost of a ship not yet gone, listening to the hush of rope against the mast, the low murmur of voices that will soon fade into the endless hush of the ocean. A name, a promise, a mystery stitched into salt and wood. The Mary Celeste, drifting ever so quietly, waiting for us to follow her into the fog. When the Mary Celeste left port that winter, her hull sat heavy with barrels of industrial alcohol packed tight below deck, each one sealed and marked with care. The sea stretched wide before her, a plain of moving gray that carried her east toward Europe, a path that should have been ordinary. The kind sailors marked with small dots on a map, and forgot once they found dry land again. Captain Benjamin Briggs stood at her helm, a man known for caution as much as for the quiet patience that life at sea demands. Beside him, his wife Sarah kept their young daughter close, her small laughter sometimes rising above the hush of waves. For the crew, there was comfort in the routine. Sails trimmed to catch the wind, rope coiled neatly by calloused hands, meals taken in the glow of lanterns swaying with each shift of the tide. In those first days, the Mary Celeste sailed true and steady, her wake a white trail lost quickly to the restless Atlantic. At dawn, the men would gather on deck, breath clouding the cold air as they checked the lines and felt the pulse of the wind in their hair. At night, they drifted into sleep with the creak of timbers above them, the ocean's hush pressing close like an old blanket. Some said the ship carried an unease stitched into her planks. Old stories about her early days as the Amazon, the captain lost to fever, the repairs that never seemed to hold. But these were only tales to pass the time, scraps of rumor traded beneath the sails while the sky turned silver and the water spoke in its low, endless voice. Once a sailor said he dreamed of standing alone on deck at midnight, staring into the fog that slipped over the rail like a ghostly hand. He dreamed he saw shapes moving just beyond the lantern's reach. Not ships, not storms, but something that waited in the hush where the sea and sky became the same soft darkness. In the morning, he said nothing, pressing the story deep into his pocket like a coin too old to spend. Yet to any who watched the Mary Celeste that week, she was simply a ship at work, wind in her sails, crew at their tasks, the captain's family tucked safe below deck. The horizon stayed calm, the swell gentle enough to rock the barrels in their hold, but not enough to shake the promise of safe passage. But the sea is wide, and in that vast hush, small things can slip away so easily. A whisper of wind, a shape in the fog, the flicker of a lantern left swinging when no one is there to catch it. These are the quiet beginnings of stories that never truly end. And the Mary Celeste drifted on, sails stretched to a wind that might carry her deeper into the secrets the Atlantic keeps hidden beneath its restless skin. The days rolled on, each sunrise caught in the sway of white sails that breathed with the wind. The Mary Celeste slipped over the waves like a thought half-formed, her bow parting the Atlantic's gray skin while gulls circled high, their cries carried away before they reached the deck. From above, she might have looked like a toy drifting between nowhere and somewhere, so small against the restless hush of the open sea. Below deck, the barrels knocked gently against each other in the dark, a quiet thump and sway that made the sailors think of ticking clocks. Each tap seemed to mark the hours they were far from home, far from the safe stone docks and warm hearths they spoke of in the half-light before sleep. But for now, there was work to do, sails to trim, rope to coil, small repairs to mend with hands rough from salt and rope burn. At night, the ocean whispered under the hull, a hush so steady that some men swore they could hear voices tucked inside the waves. Old sailors lost to storms, or dreams spun out of the salt wind. A few shook off the thought with a laugh, saying the sea always played tricks when the stars blinked cold and the fog slipped close. Sometimes, when the weather turned still and the wind fell asleep, the Mary Celeste would drift slow, sails sagging like tired wings. The men would lean over the rail, peering into a sea so flat it felt like glass, as if they might see another world floating just below the surface. Shadows of fish sliding past, shapes that looked too much like hands if you stared too long. They spoke little then, their voices catching in the damp air before they fell quiet again. Captain Briggs kept watch with a calm that steadied the crew. He wrote neat lines in the ship's log, his handwriting careful, the ink trembling only when the ship rolled beneath his feet. He noted the wind, the course, the weather, small facts meant to hold back the vastness of the Atlantic. Yet even his steady words could not stop the way the sea seemed to fold around them, hiding whatever waited beyond each pale horizon. In the galley, Sarah Briggs tucked her daughter into a narrow bunk, humming soft lullabies that mingled with the creak of timbers and the hush of water tapping the hull. She dreamed of home, of stone streets and candles flickering in windows. But when she woke to the groan of rope and the slap of a wave, she knew that home was only an idea carried with them, fragile as a flame in a storm. And so the Mary Celeste sailed on, a small world afloat in a vast hush, sails breathing in and out while the ocean whispered its secrets to a crew that, for now, still had each other to lean on in the fog. The wind did not always stay gentle. Some days it rose without warning, pushing the Mary Celeste harder through the swells until her timbers creaked with the strain. Dark clouds gathered at the edge of the sky, drifting slow at first, like a blanket someone forgot to pull tight. The crew watched the horizon with the wary eyes of men who knew that calm was never promised for long. When the first cold rain fell, it pattered across the sails like fingers drumming on a door that no one wished to open. The captain ordered lines checked, barrels secured, sails trimmed closer to ride out whatever the Atlantic decided to send their way. Even so, there was no sense of panic, only the steady shuffle of boots on wet planks, the low hum of rope pulled through calloused hands. Below deck, the cargo shifted gently with each roll of the hull. Barrels knocked against each other in the dark hold, echoing in the minds of the men who lay awake listening to every sound. They told themselves that the ship was sturdy, that she had survived worse storms under her old name. Yet somewhere deep inside, a quiet thought settled, that names changed easily, but the sea did not. Sarah Briggs held her daughter close as the wind moaned through the gaps in the timbers. She whispered stories that braided old memories with new ones, letting the child drift into sleep before the waves rose again. In that hush, she heard it too, the way the ocean spoke through the hull, a slow language made of water and wood, and secrets too big for any single ship to carry. On deck, lanterns swung in their hooks, little beads of light swallowed by the mist that slipped over the rail, curling around boots and barrels alike. Some men swore they saw shapes in the fog, shadows that flickered and vanished just as quickly, like thoughts you could almost hold before they dissolved. They spoke of it in low voices, careful not to wake the hush too much, because out here, the hush always listened. Captain Briggs noted each shift in the weather, the wind's turn, the rain's cold persistence. His log grew thicker with lines that marked nothing unusual, yet the spaces between the words seemed to hold more than they said. It was just weather, they told themselves. Just fog, just rain, just the old voice of the Atlantic, reminding them how small any ship could feel when the sky pressed close. And so the Mary Celeste sailed on, her sails damp with mist, her hull cradling lives that leaned into the hush each night, dreaming of land they could not yet see, and secrets they did not yet know they carried with them, stitched into every plank and wave. When the wind eased, it left behind a silence so wide it seemed to press on the sails like a gentle hand. The Mary Celeste drifted under a sky the color of tarnished silver. Clouds stretched thin across the horizon while the sea turned glassy, each swell slow and deliberate, as if the Atlantic itself were holding its breath. The crew moved through their tasks in this hush, boots scuffing the wet planks, eyes flicking to the rail where the mist clung low and restless. They spoke in shorter sentences now, laughter trailing off before it could fill the cold air. Sometimes they traded small rumors like coins, stories of the ship's old name, tales of captains who never returned, the whisper that some vessels are born unlucky, no matter how many new coats of paint you give them. Captain Briggs kept his men steady with the same calm he carried from port, but even he could feel how the hush settled deep into the boards, the ropes, the barrels that knocked gently in the dark. He wrote in the log each morning, careful words about the drift of the wind, the state of the sea, the rations stacked neat and dry below deck. On the page, nothing seemed out of place, but stories have a way of slipping between the lines, drifting like mist where ink cannot follow. Below, in the small cabin where Sarah Briggs tended to her child, the hush pressed closer. She hummed the same old lullabies, though sometimes the words seemed to tangle, as if they could not quite find their place in the cold air. Her daughter asked when they would see land, if the ocean ever ended, and Sarah smiled, brushing a curl from the child's forehead, speaking soft promises she hoped the sea would not hear. One evening, as the lanterns burned low, a sailor stood watch near the bow. He swore he saw a shape slip across the deck, not a man, not a shadow, but something in between, a shimmer of motion that vanished when he blinked. He did not tell the others, not right away. Some things lose their edge when kept inside, held like a smooth stone in the palm of a shaking hand. Still, the work continued, sails trimmed to catch the faintest breath of wind, barrels checked again and again, as if the men feared the hush might steal their cargo too. They leaned over the rail sometimes, watching the sea slip by, their eyes tracing ripples that led nowhere. Some said they heard voices when the fog drifted thick, words that rose and fell like a language too old to name. And in the hush that folded over each bunk at night, they dreamed. Small dreams at first, of home, of warm hearths and soft beds that did not sway. But tucked beneath those dreams lay something colder, the sense that the Mary Celeste carried more than barrels and sails. That deep in her bones, the ship knew how to hold a secret, drifting slow and empty through the waves that waited patient and wide. There came a day when the wind stirred again, not with the roar of a storm, but with a sly kind of whisper that made the sails shiver at their edges. The Mary Celeste drifted through patches of fog so thick they seemed to carry their own weight, pressing close around the rails, blurring where the sea ended and the sky began. Men leaned over the side, peering into the pale hush that wrapped the ship like a second skin. Now and then, the ocean would open just enough to show a glimpse of distant water, a darker patch where swells rose and fell like the slow breath of something sleeping far beneath. They watched these places for too long sometimes, eyes stinging from salt and cold, hearts beating to a rhythm they could not quite name. Below deck, the barrels rocked gently, the same steady knock that had once comforted them now felt louder, as if the wood spoke a language no one wished to learn. A sailor who had kept his dreams quiet now woke sweating, mumbling of footsteps on the deck at midnight, of voices that slipped through the cracks in the walls like smoke. Captain Briggs listened when he could, calm as always, his hand pressed firm to the logbook that now seemed to gather more than just the weather. He wrote each word in a neat line, yet the hush between those lines felt heavier, filled with questions no ink could settle. He told his crew to hold steady, to watch the sails, the ropes, the barrels sealed tight. But he too felt the hush gather close, pressing its cold breath against the back of his neck when he turned to face the mist. Sarah Briggs moved quietly in her cabin, brushing her daughter's hair back from her face, telling small stories of home that no longer sounded as warm as they once had. She could feel the tremble in the hull, a faint vibration that never quite faded, even when the sea seemed calm. Sometimes she stood by the small round window, staring out into a pale nothing that looked back at her with patient eyes. At night, lanterns swayed on their hooks, casting slow-moving shadows that crept along the deck, across barrels and boots left where someone forgot them. The men gathered near the firelight below, their words dropping soft into the hush, never quite finishing their thoughts. Someone said they heard knocking at the rail, as if something called from the water. Another laughed it off, but the laugh came too quick, the kind you use to push the fear down before it finds its voice. Yet the Mary Celeste sailed on, her sails tugged by winds that did not roar, but whispered instead, curling around ropes and masts like fingers tugging at secrets. Above her, the moon drifted behind veils of cloud, slipping out now and then to watch the ship move through water that held its hush close, a hush big enough to keep even the loudest question quiet. And through it all, the crew drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, trusting the timbers beneath them for one more night, listening to the soft slap of waves and the low creak of rope, not knowing that some stories decide long before the last lantern goes out how they will be remembered. When the wind settled back into a softer breath, the Mary Celeste seemed to sigh with it, timbers relaxing into the hush that wrapped her from mast to hull. The fog that had pressed so close drifted apart for a while, letting pale sunlight slip through in wavering sheets that touched the damp sails like a hesitant hand. For a moment, it almost felt like calm. The crew moved about their tasks with slower steps, boots leaving prints on the deck that dried before the next mist arrived. They coiled ropes, checked the barrels once more, let the salt wind brush across faces lined with days at sea and nights that refused to give them rest. Yet beneath this gentle weather, something lingered, a question that trailed behind them like a shadow tied to their wake. Some of the men said they could hear tapping below deck, not the usual knock of barrels shifting with the roll of the sea, but a softer sound, irregular, like knuckles against wood. Each man who heard it stayed quiet, pressing the thought deep down where it could not bloom into fear. Captain Briggs stood at the helm longer these days, his eyes sweeping the horizon as if it might give him an answer he could pin between the neat lines of his logbook. The pages grew full of small notations, wind direction, distance, weather, the quiet kind of facts that seemed to promise control. But his hand paused now and then, pen hovering above blank space, waiting for a word that never came. Below, Sarah Briggs tended to her daughter's feverish dreams. The child woke often now, eyes wide in the half-dark, saying she heard someone walking the deck when no one was there. Sarah stroked her hair, shushed her back to sleep, though each time she did, she found herself listening too, to the creak of timbers, the hush of water brushing the hull, the small, uncertain echoes that lived in the walls. The men spoke less in the evenings, gathering near the dim lanterns that swayed just enough to make shadows dance across their boots. One swore he saw a figure pass between barrels in the hold, a shape so quick he almost doubted it had been there at all. He told no one, not directly, just let the story drift in pieces, a rumor that caught in the hush and stayed there. On the calmest nights, the ocean itself felt alive with secrets, a surface so smooth it seemed to hold its breath, hiding what lay beneath. Some sailors said they dreamed of looking down through clear water and seeing the shape of the Mary Celeste reflected back at them. But empty, no faces at the rails, no sails above, only a ghost ship drifting under the stars. Yet each dawn, they rose and worked as sailors do, trusting wood and rope, the charts in the captain's cabin, the way the wind would find them again soon enough. They told themselves the hush was only the sea being the sea, that the barrels would stay sealed, the sails would hold, and the ship would carry them forward, ever so quietly, into whatever the Atlantic chose to keep. When the sky cleared, the Mary Celeste drifted under a stretch of blue, so wide it almost seemed kind. The sails filled just enough to keep her moving, slow and steady, across the Atlantic's glassy back. For a moment, the men let themselves breathe easier, salt wind in their hair, the smell of the sea stronger than any shadow tucked away below deck. They still spoke in quiet voices, trading stories of home like small lanterns passed hand to hand. Some imagined the harbor waiting on the other side, the sound of boots on stone streets, warm bread breaking in good company. They tucked these thoughts around their shoulders like blankets against the wind, though no one forgot the hush that drifted through the ship each night. In the hold, the barrels sat heavy and still, rings of iron cool to the touch. The men checked them by habit now, knocking softly with the backs of their knuckles, listening for any echo that did not belong. Once, someone thought they heard a hollow ring where it should have been solid, but when they lifted the lid, everything lay just as it should, sealed, quiet, waiting. Sarah Briggs pressed her ear to the wall sometimes, listening to the low murmur of waves just beyond the timber. She whispered stories to her daughter in the dim light, her words soft enough to keep the hush from noticing. The child asked fewer questions now, her small voice drifting off before answers came. Some nights, she slept with her hand pressed to the wall, as if feeling for the heartbeat of the ship beneath her. Captain Briggs walked the deck alone after the sun slipped under the waves, the lantern at his side swaying with each step. He watched the sails breathe against the stars, felt the wood shift under his boots, sturdy yet somehow softer than it should be. He thought of the rumors he had laughed off in port, about ships that carried curses stitched into their planks, about old names that should never have been buried beneath new paint. The crew, too, felt the hush settle into their bones. They dreamed of voices that called from far below the waterline, of footsteps moving where no one walked, of the soft click of rope against wood when the wind fell so still it could not make a sound. They woke to find nothing changed. Sails full, barrels secure, the sea rolling steady and wide. Yet the sense of something waiting only grew. By day, the sun wrapped the Mary Celeste in a false warmth, glinting off wet ropes and the brass that lined the captain's compass. By night, the fog returned in slow breaths, drifting around the rail like a patient hand smoothing the edge of a dream. The ocean spoke its old language under the hull, a hush too big to follow, too quiet to hold. And so they sailed on, a ship within a story that had not yet found its ending, a name waiting to drift, empty and quiet, across the same Atlantic that gave her life and whispered, even now, that some secrets choose to stay lost. When the wind dropped once more, the Mary Celeste drifted under a sky that looked almost too clear, a blue so pale it seemed to swallow every shape the eye could hold. The sails hung like weary arms, catching only the smallest breath to keep her bow pointed east, toward a horizon that gave back no promise but more open water. The crew moved carefully through these windless days, their boots softer on the deck, their voices folded into the hush that grew between the creak of rope and the slow slap of waves against the hull. No one spoke much of the shapes they thought they saw near the rails at night, the flicker of movement that never stayed long enough to greet. Captain Briggs kept his log as steady as his hand would allow, the lines neat but narrower now, each word pressed close to the next, as if more space on the page might invite more shadows to gather. He stood at the helm long after the lanterns were lit, eyes tracing the horizon for a sign, a sail, a bird, a shift in the water that might say land was not so far. But the Atlantic only breathed its slow, endless hush, slipping between his thoughts until the ink dried in his pen. Below deck, Sarah Briggs lay beside her daughter, fingers brushing curls damp with uneasy sleep. The child murmured in half-formed dreams, words drifting up like bubbles that never broke the surface. Sarah closed her eyes and listened for the hush she had once found comforting, but now it seemed too big to belong only to the sea. Near the barrels, a sailor paused his work, listening for the soft knock that had come and gone these past nights. He found only silence, a silence so complete it felt heavier than any sound. He touched the barrel's lid, cold and slick with the sweat of the ocean, and for a moment he wondered if the ship itself might be breathing in the dark. In the cramped galley, the men ate what was left of the fresh bread, their mouths full of quiet they could not swallow away. One spoke of a dream he had not wanted to keep, of standing on the deck and seeing the Mary Celeste beside him, but empty, sails set for a wind that did not blow, every rope in its place, yet no hand to hold it steady. The others only nodded, letting the dream drift away before it could settle too deep. At night, the fog returned thicker than before, wrapping each lantern in a halo that could not reach past the rails. The ocean rose and fell with the same soft pulse, a heartbeat the crew no longer trusted to carry them home. They watched the mist breathe over the bow, slip between barrels, settle under bunks where sleep came thin and restless. And still, the Mary Celeste sailed on, drifting toward an ending no one on board could see, her name stitching itself into the hush that held her. The hush that waited for the moment when even the last voice would fall silent, leaving only the soft creak of rope and the sigh of waves carrying her story ever onward. When the last day came that anyone could mark in the captain's log, the Mary Celeste still moved, sails half-breathing in a wind too thin to promise anything more. The ocean lay wide and patient beneath her keel, each wave folding and unfolding like an old letter too smudged to read. No one on board could say when the hush turned from a comfort into something deeper, a quiet so complete it seemed to reach into every thought, every step, every heartbeat that echoed along the planks. The barrels knocked softly in the dark hold, a lullaby that never finished its song. Captain Briggs's last words in the log were careful and plain, just a note of course and weather, a promise to hold steady. But the pages after that stayed blank, lines waiting for words that would never come. Some say the sea itself kept those words, folded them into the hush where stories slipped through fingers like grains of salt. Below deck, Sarah Briggs's lullabies fell into silence, her voice carried off by the same wind that carried the sails toward an empty horizon. Her daughter's small hand rested on the cabin wall, as if to feel the pulse of the ship one last time before sleep closed her eyes. Those who later found the Mary Celeste drifting far from where she should have been spoke of the ship as they found her, sails set, cargo safe, meals left waiting, as if the people who moved through those narrow passages had simply stepped outside for a moment and forgotten their way back. No sign of struggle, no storm to blame, only the hush that lingered in the ropes, the creak of empty planks that still remembered footsteps they could no longer hold. Some stories say the ocean claimed them gently, one by one, slipping them into the mist that slips between waves and dreams. Others say the ship carried something no chart could name, a secret that needed silence more than it needed a map to follow. Even now, long after the sails have fallen and the name has drifted from logbooks to legend, the Mary Celeste still moves in the minds of those who listen closely. She drifts on the hush of the Atlantic, a ghost ship that never truly found its harbor, a question stitched into the rolling fog. If you stand by the shore some quiet night and let the waves whisper at your feet, you might hear it too. The soft creak of rope, the distant knock of barrels, the hush of a story that asks nothing of you but to drift, to listen, and to slip, ever so gently, into sleep. If your eyes have already closed, if you have slipped far from these drifting sails and hush of waves, then stay there, deep in your dreams, and may the ghost ship carry you only into warmth and rest. But if you are still here with me, awake enough to feel the hush brushing at your mind, then stay just a little longer. This is our quiet corner, our boring history for sleep, where stories slow the world down until you can drift wherever you need to go. Next, we leave the rolling sea behind and walk into Coldstone, a tower, they called it, tall and watchful above the river. Inad, two brothers once slept in feather beds meant for princes, and woke to whispers no bed could soften. They were kept safe, they were told. But stones remember more than words do, and when the world asked where they had gone, the tower stayed silent, its walls holding secrets older than any crown. So settle in, breathe soft, and let me share with you the hush of the princes in the tower. The brothers who disappeared. Long before the Tower of London became just another shadow on a map, it was a promise made of stone, a place built to guard the crown, to watch the river wind its silver way past the city's restless heart. They called it fortress, prison, palace all at once, though the walls made no difference to the wind that slipped through its narrow windows at night. Inside these thick walls, two young brothers once slept. They were princes, not yet kings, but close enough that the weight of crowns already pressed against their dreams. Their names drift through the centuries like whispers tucked between stones. Edward, the older, just a boy, but already called king by those who knelt at his feet. And Richard, his brother, his shadow, never far behind in step or laughter. They came to the tower not as prisoners, but as royal guests, so the story was told. A place to keep them safe while the world beyond the gate settled its quarrels and sharpened its knives. Feather beds waited for them in chambers warmed by crackling fires, tapestries bright with the stories of men who fought and fell long before these two opened their eyes. Yet stone remembers more than comfort. The tower had held kings before, some who walked out with their crowns steadier, some who never walked out at all. Its corridors whispered when the torches burned low, the guards pacing in armor that clanked like distant thunder down empty halls. No one knows for certain when the hush began to thicken around the brothers' rooms. Maybe it was the flicker of footsteps that did not match the guards' boots. Maybe it was the way doors closed softly in the night when no one was meant to be near. Or maybe it was just the tower itself, drawing breath, holding secrets tight behind walls, too old to trust completely. Outside, the river flowed on, carrying news of battles fought far from these stone walls, carrying rumors about who would wear the crown if a boy king did not wake to claim it. The people looked up at the tower's sharp edges and wondered who slept behind its arrow slits, and whether sleep was a gift or a trap. And inside, the two princes, young enough to believe that grown men would always protect them, lay wrapped in blankets stitched with gold thread, drifting through dreams where halls were warm and voices kind. Somewhere down the corridor, a guard shifted his weight, armor sighing against stone, a small sound swallowed by the hush that settled deeper with each passing night. So begins the story of the princes in the tower. Two brothers, a crown too heavy for small shoulders, and walls that remember more than they ever say aloud. Inside the tower, days slipped by the way mist slips across stone, slow, almost invisible, but never really gone. The two brothers woke to the soft creak of guards shifting outside their doors, boots tapping quiet messages that echoed just enough to remind them they were never alone. In daylight, the tower did its best to feel less like a cage. Servants brought warm bread, small bowls of sweet fruit when they could be found. Stories from the city whispered in careful voices so the boys might believe the world outside was still gentle. Edward, the elder, sometimes stood by the narrow window, forehead pressed to the cold glass, his breath leaving small ghosts that vanished before they reached the courtyard below. Richard stayed close to his brother, his shadow in every hallway, a hand curled around Edward's sleeve when footsteps in the corridor turned unfamiliar. The boys would play at knighthood, swords made of sticks, crowns folded from scraps of parchment, the echoes of their laughter climbing up stone staircases to linger where torchlight flickered. Yet stone listens, and stone remembers. The tower had learned long ago how to keep a secret, how to swallow voices in the dark and offer back only the hush of its walls. Some nights, when the servants left and the boys curled under blankets stitched with lions and fleur-de-lis, the hush seemed heavier than before. Whispers trickled in with the changing guards, small rumors, soft enough to feel like dreams, that the throne was not safe yet, that men in high places might be safer still if two young princes stayed behind these walls a little longer. The boys did not hear these words the way grown men did, but they felt them, the way a chill slips under a door when the fire burns low. At dusk, torches sputtered to life in the narrow corridors, shadows stretched long across tapestries that told stories of kings who never lost their crowns, or who lost more than any crown could ever hold. The brothers drifted to sleep with these woven battles above their beds, battles that felt far away and old, as if they belonged to men who never knew the hush of the tower. Somewhere beyond their chamber, armor sighed against stone, guards passing each other without looking too long into any one doorway. In that hush, the tower held its breath, gathering these two small secrets close. Two brothers, two crowns yet to be worn, and a silence that promised to remember every heartbeat, every word, long after footsteps faded into mist. As the night stretched longer, the hush inside the tower thickened, wrapping itself around every stone step and iron latch. The young princes slept behind heavy doors, the warmth of feather beds pressed close against the chill that never quite left these ancient walls. In the small hours, footsteps rose and fell along the corridor, the slow, patient tread of guards who kept watch over secrets too young to understand the weight they carried. Sometimes the footsteps paused outside the chamber, as if a question lingered there in the dark, a question no one dared speak aloud. Edward often woke to the scrape of armor, the soft click of a sword hilt brushing a belt. He would lie still, eyes open to the flicker of torchlight sneaking under the door. Beside him, Richard slept with his hand tucked beneath his cheek, breathing slow, small fingers curling against the pillow, as if to catch whatever dream he drifted through. When dawn came, the tower did its best to look gentle again. Fresh rushes scattered on the floor, bread still warm from the fires below. The river's mist creeping up to the narrow windows like a shy visitor too polite to knock. Servants smiled as they filled cups with watered wine, their voices bright with stories of the world beyond the gates, but behind every smile lay a hush, the same hush that slipped between words like a shadow waiting to grow. Some guards whispered that they saw the princes standing by the window late at night, two small figures pressed close together, looking out over London's sleeping rooftops as if searching for something they could never quite find. Others said they heard the boys speaking in low voices, making promises to each other that no crown could break, the kind of promises that sound so strong when whispered through stone, but grow thin once the door closes and footsteps echo away. The tower kept these whispers close. Its walls had learned over centuries how to carry secrets from one guard to the next, from one servant to another, until the same rumor drifted through every chamber like mist, through a courtyard at dawn. Some said the princes would soon be crowned, that the hush was just the world waiting for the right moment. Others said the hush was not waiting at all, but creeping closer, step by step, each night a little darker than the last. And so the brothers slept, small hands tangled in blankets, stitched with golden lions and red roses. They dreamed of crowns, of laughter and open gardens, of footsteps that came not to close doors, but to open them wide. Yet the tower, with its cold stones and narrow stairs, listened to each breath they took, collecting each one like a promise it intended to keep long after the world forgot the voices behind those heavy doors. As the weeks slipped by, the tower seemed to grow taller in the eyes of those who watched its stone walls from the city below. From the street, its windows looked like dark eyes, too narrow to see through, too old to trust with what they hid. Smoke drifted from its chimneys at dawn, thin ribbons that curled into the gray sky, while rumors drifted through London's crooked lanes like fallen leaves caught in an autumn breeze. Inside, the two princes lived between flickers of daylight and long, muffled nights. By day, they played games to keep the hush at bay, racing down small halls lined with tapestries, counting the number of steps to the chamber door, trying to remember the smell of roses that did not grow behind these walls. Laughter rose now and then, soft as a candle's flame, but never bright enough to fill the corridors for long. The guards changed shifts with careful steps, boots tapping on cold stone like a lullaby with no words. Some brought small treats hidden in the folds of their cloaks, sweet bread, a piece of fruit, a scrap of parchment folded into a crown. They called the boys "Your Grace," and bowed as they passed, but their eyes flicked sideways to the shadows that pooled near each doorway. In the evenings, torchlight stretched the tower's secrets wider. Flames danced along ancient walls that had learned to hold more than warmth. Servants spoke low, carrying trays from room to room, their voices slipping between doorways like threads of a half-finished story. Some nights, a figure would appear at the far end of a hallway, just beyond the reach of the nearest torch, a shadow wrapped in a cloak, lingering too long before melting back into the hush. Edward sometimes asked about the kingdom outside these stone ribs. He wanted to know when he could wear the crown that waited for him, small and heavy, in a chamber far beyond his reach. Richard only looked at him with eyes too old for his years, a hand resting on his brother's sleeve, as if to say what neither boy could speak aloud. They lay in their feather beds as the hush grew deeper each night. Dreams came and went like clouds drifting over a moon, some bright with gardens and birdsong, others pressed tight with the sound of footsteps circling their door. When they woke, The same narrow window looked out at the river's slow breath, the city's towers lost behind a curtain of early morning mist. No one spoke of how long the boys would stay, not to them, not to each other. The tower, ancient and patient, knew how to hold its breath for years if it must. It learned to tuck each secret into cracks between stones, to hush even the smallest rumor until it felt like a ghost that might slip away if named aloud. And so the two brothers drifted from one dusk to the next, laughter fading into whispers, footsteps fading into shadows, the hush pressing against the heavy doors, waiting for the moment when a crown would no longer weigh more than a promise meant to be kept. Beyond the tower walls, the city of London murmured with stories that slipped from mouth to mouth like secrets no one could hold for long. In taverns where the air tasted of smoke and spilled ale, men spoke in hushes of the princes behind stone, their young faces pressed to narrow windows, waiting for a crown that might never find its way to them. Merchants passing by the river slowed their carts to glance up at the tower's sharp edges. They wondered if the boys still laughed behind those walls, if they knew how many voices called their names in streets that curved like questions around every corner. But inside, the tower kept its answers quiet, each stone holding fast to the hush that grew thicker with each passing dusk. In the prince's rooms, the days settled into a pattern soft as a lullaby, too worn to be remembered in full. Servants came and went, carrying warm broth and small loaves of bread wrapped in cloth. Sometimes a guard would slip in a sweet hidden in his sleeve, placed carefully on the edge of a plate. A small kindness, spoken with eyes that never lingered too long. Edward stood taller now by the window, forehead resting against the cold glass. He traced shapes into the mist that clung to the panes at dawn. Castles he imagined on hills beyond the river, horses waiting on green fields where no walls could stand so close. Richard, his shadow and shield, drifted from game to game, laughter softer now. Small feet that once ran across rugs now paused more often by the door, listening. At night, the hush deepened. The torchlight flickered across banners stitched with golden lions, symbols of a crown that waited somewhere beyond the tower's teeth. Some guards whispered prayers when they passed the prince's chamber, breath catching on words too thin to reach the boys' dreams. Others turned away quickly, boots echoing down steps that had felt too many secrets under their weight. Rumors crawled back inside the tower too. Servants heard them first. Stories that men in high places wanted the hush to stay exactly as it was. No questions asked, no doors opened too wide. They folded these whispers into their aprons and sleeves, carried them down to the kitchens, never daring to speak them near the boys, whose laughter had already grown too soft. Sometimes, when the wind rose from the river, the tower shivered. The brothers would wake in their feather beds, eyes wide in the flicker of dying candles. They would find each other's hands under the blankets, pressing small fingers together as if that touch alone could keep the hush at bay. And so another night settled like mist in the corridors, a promise wrapped in cold stones and narrow stairs. The tower, ever patient, held the brothers close, two young hearts beating quietly behind doors too thick to hear them clearly, two crowns waiting somewhere just beyond reach, where no whisper could find them now. When night fell across the tower, it pressed the old stones into a hush so deep that every step felt borrowed from another story. Guards paced their narrow circles, lanterns swinging low, their small flames trembling where the wind slid through what cracks no one could ever fully seal. Some said the tower sighed at night, wood and stone groaning softly, as if trying to shift the weight of secrets it had carried for too many winters. Along these passages, footsteps echoed, soft boots on worn steps, a cough swallowed into a gloved hand, a breath caught before it could slip too far. One new guard, younger than the rest, asked once why the princes never left their rooms to walk the courtyard, as they once had. An older man, his beard silvered by years, in the tower's chill, only shook his head, eyes flicking toward the flicker of torchlight that burned too close to certain doors. Best not to wonder too much, he whispered, voice so thin it might have belonged to the stones themselves. Inside the prince's chamber, the boys lay awake more often now. Edward, restless, would swing his feet to the cold floor, pacing the small space, until his breath clouded the window with ghosts he could not name. Richard watched him from the bed, eyes half closed, but never truly sleeping, his small hands curled under his chin, as if to hold every heartbeat inside his chest. When sleep did come, it came in fragments. A dream of open gardens, a dream of horses running free beyond gates that never closed. But always, behind those soft visions, the hush lingered. A shadow in the hallway, a door that clicked shut too gently to be trusted. The quiet sigh of armor settling against stone just outside their reach. Down the passage, servants carried trays and empty bowls, voices dropping to murmurs when they passed the prince's door. They told themselves the boys would be crowned soon, that these walls would open again when the world was ready. Yet each time they said it, they felt the hush catch their words and fold them away, deep in the tower's cold heart. In the guardhouse, men leaned close to the fire that never burned quite hot enough, hands stretched over glowing coals while they traded stories half in jest, half in dread. Some claimed they heard children's laughter echo through the walls when the corridors were empty, laughter too small and distant to chase, yet too real to forget. But no one left their post. No one asked the questions that knocked at the edges of their sleep. The tower taught them to watch, to guard, and to listen, but never to speak too loud when the hush wanted silence more than truth. And so the princes lay beneath blankets embroidered with crowns, eyes wide open to shadows that danced like ghosts across the old stones. The tower listened as it always had, patient, unblinking, waiting for footsteps to fade one by one, until only the hush remained. As the days bled into one another, the tower's hush grew thick enough to catch every footstep, every half-formed question that might have drifted between the old stones. At dusk, when the river turned black under a sky the color of tarnished silver, the corridors filled with the soft scrape of armor, the low sigh of men too tired to speak above a whisper. Some nights, the glow of torches seemed to waver more than it should, their small flames bending away from certain doors as if the tower itself had grown shy. Guards moved with their heads lowered, boots brushing straw scattered to muffle the sound of those who came and went behind doors that never opened quite wide enough. In their chamber, the princes lay still. Edward would stir first, lifting his head when the faint creak of hinges reached through the hush. He would listen for the soft click of boots turning away, the hush swallowing the echo before it reached his brother's dreams. Richard, smaller, curled tighter in the blankets, his breath steady but shallow, the shape of his shoulders a small hill under linen stitched with faded lions. The servants came less often now, trays lighter each day, their footsteps quicker through the corridor that curved like a question around the tower's keep. No one spoke to the boys about when they might see the garden again, or when the gate would swing wide and the crown would settle soft on a young king's brow. These promises had turned to mist, clinging to the old walls like stories best left half told. Sometimes, a guard would stand a moment too long by the prince's door, gloved hand resting on the hilt of a sword he never meant to draw. He might close his eyes and listen for a sound that never came, a voice, a laugh, a small knock from within. When none came, he would move on, lantern swinging at his hip, the hush closing behind him like a sigh too patient to be chased away. Outside, the city still wondered. In crooked alleys, men leaned close over mugs of ale, voices dropping low when they spoke the prince's names. Some said they had been sent away in secret, kept safe until the time was right. Others said the tower never gave back what it kept for too long. No one agreed, yet everyone watched the windows, looking for a flicker of candlelight that might promise the boys were still there, tucked warm behind stone. But the tower, ancient as breath itself, knew how to hold its secrets close. It tucked them into corners where footsteps could not find them, where even dreams sank without leaving a ripple. And in the hush, the two brothers dreamed their small dreams. Gardens with open gates, voices calling them home, hands never closing doors behind them. The stones listened as they always had, the old mortar breathing slow beneath the weight of crowns and quiet. And when dawn came pale and soft against the narrow window, the tower stood as it always did, silent, watchful, patient enough to keep its hush a little while longer. By the time the last leaves fell from the trees beyond the tower walls, the hush inside had settled so deep that even the oldest stones seemed to hold their breath. The city below turned cold, its rooftops glazed with frost that melted in thin streaks by midday. People glanced up at the tower's sharp edges and wondered if the small shadows behind those narrow windows still woke each morning to watch the river flow. Inside, the corridors felt longer than ever. Guards paced their careful routes, lanterns swinging soft arcs of light that did little to warm the air. Boots scuffed across rushes spread thin along the stones. a sound that rose and fell until it faded into the hush, waiting at every turn. The princes slept more often now, or seemed to. Edward still dreamed with his eyes half open, lashes resting on pale cheeks that had grown older in the space of whispers. Richard curled close beside him, a small hill of blankets that rose and fell with each shallow breath, his hands sometimes slipping toward the edge of the bed, as if reaching for something he could not quite find. When servants came, they moved like ghosts, steps light, eyes lowered. They left small plates on the heavy table, never waiting to see if the boys would wake to eat. Each tray held less than the last, yet no one spoke of hunger aloud. The hush had learned to swallow the clink of spoon on metal, the quiet scrape of a chair pushed back too slowly to echo. In the guardhouse, men leaned near the fire, voices low as they repeated the same rumors in circles that never broke. Some said the boys were safe in the country now, spirited away under the cover of a moonless sky. Others only stared into the coals, remembering footsteps that had slipped down the corridor and never returned. A few guards paused when they passed the prince's chamber door, hands brushing the cold iron latch as if testing whether it might open of its own accord. They said nothing, only breathed the hush in deep, letting it settle in their bones like winter. Outside, the river moved on, carrying no sign of the secrets the tower held so close. People in the city found new stories to chase, new whispers to wrap around mugs of ale, and the crackle of fires that burned brighter than the small candles flickering behind narrow windows. And within the tower, the hush wrapped itself tighter, sealing corners no light could reach. The stones remembered the laughter that once bounced along the corridor, the echo of wooden swords clashing in games that felt older than they were. Now only the softest sound remained, the slow hush of breath beneath heavy blankets, the whisper of dreams that drifted like mist through walls too thick to answer back. The tower, patient and watchful, kept its small secrets close. 2 brothers, 2 crowns never worn, and the hush that promised to hold them just as they were, far from the world that waited outside the gate. When the last candle flickered low in the chamber's corner, the tower seemed to lean closer around the boys, its old stones pressing the hush deeper into every crack. The narrow window offered nothing but the slow drift of river mist, slipping past as if it, too, did not wish to linger too long. The guards still walked their rounds, boots soft against the rushes scattered along the corridor floor. They did not speak of the princes behind the door, nor did they ask why the plates on the table stayed untouched longer now. A nod here, a shift of a lantern there, enough to say they had done their duty, and nothing more. Edward sometimes lay awake through the hush, eyes tracing the pattern of shadows thrown by the last dying flame. He would listen to Richard's breath, shallow and even, and remember the sound of laughter that once bounced against these stones when the days still felt full of gardens and green hills no wall could hide. Richard's dreams came in half shapes, a garden gate swinging open, a crown set carefully on a brow too young to hold its weight, footsteps soft in corridors that led only to light. Yet when he woke, the cold returned, settling around him like a cloak that the blankets could not chase away. The servants passed by, heads bowed, voices dropped to the hush that the tower had taught them to keep. Some said they heard the faint murmur of the boys talking to each other in the dark, promises traded under breath that no stone would dare repeat. Others said they heard nothing at all, that the hush had grown too thick, swallowing even the smallest secrets before they could drift beyond the door. In the guardhouse, the fire burned lower than it had in many winters. The older men looked into its glow, eyes flicking to the door, or each time the wind rattled the latch. Now and then, one would mutter a prayer not for himself, but for the princes, their names carried off in the smoke that slipped out through the chimney and disappeared into the night. The city beyond the tower walls moved on, carts creaking through the fog, traders shouting their wares in streets slick with rain. They spoke the princes' names less often now, the rumor growing soft at the edges until it frayed into silence. Some wondered if the boys still watched the river in their dreams, or if the tower had tucked them so deep inside its stones that even dreams could not find them. And so the nights passed, each one folding over the last like pages in a book left open too long. The hush grew patient, wrapping itself around small shoulders curled beneath blankets stitched with crowns and roses. The tower, ancient as any promise whispered in the dark, waited, holding 2 brothers close, holding their breath, holding the quiet that kept them safe, or lost, or perhaps only sleeping in the hush that stone remembers best. When the final night came, or perhaps it did not come all at once, but drifted in like mist through cracks in old stone, the tower held its breath so tightly that even the footsteps of guards fell silent before they reached the prince's door. No one would say for certain when the laughter slipped away for good, when the hush inside the chamber grew so deep that even dreams began to fold themselves into the walls. Some claimed they heard soft voices in the dark, two brothers whispering promises only the stones would ever keep. Others said the room stayed empty of sound, a hush so complete that it pressed against the door like a secret too old to share. The city beyond the tower's shadow woke each morning to the river's slow song, its people bending closer to hearth fires as the chill of rumor settled into their bones. Some spoke the prince's names less and less, letting them fade from the corners of alehouse tales, while others carried the story like an ember tucked in a pocket, warming cold hands through the longest nights. Inside, the tower did what it had always done. It watched, it waited. Its stones held the small echoes of laughter that once bounced down narrow stairs, the soft footfalls of two boys running where no gate could follow. It remembered how they leaned close together, how their shadows merged in torchlight when footsteps slowed in the corridor outside. Years would pass, and the tower would stand just as it had, sharp against a sky that could not wash it clean. Visitors would walk its crooked passages, boots tapping out questions that no guard could answer. They would stand by the window, looking down at the slow curve of the river, and wonder if two small faces had ever stared out from the same glass, tracing shapes in the frost, dreaming of crowns they would never wear. No one ever found a truth that could settle the hush for good. Some say the boys were taken far away, hidden in fields too wide for rumor to reach. Others say the tower kept them in the only way stone knows how, holding them quiet, holding them close, until even their dreams sank deep into the mortar, soft as breath. And if you stand there now, where the stairs bend in shadow and the walls lean in just enough to hear you think, you might feel it still. The hush that remembers, the cold that hums with the heartbeat of two princes whose footsteps never truly left. They drift there, caught in the slow turn of centuries, a lullaby pressed into stone, a story that asks nothing of you but to listen, to breathe, to slip into sleep as the tower closes its eyes once more. If you've drifted off somewhere quiet by now, curled up deeper than these old stones and the hush they keep, then may your sleep stay gentle and untouched until morning finds you warm. But if you're still here with me, awake enough to feel this hush breathing around you, then stay a little longer. This is our small corner of boring history for sleep. Stories left soft enough to carry you into dreams that ask nothing more than your steady breath. Next, we'll leave the tower's stone behind and walk into snow, a land of ice and wind, where Vikings once built small homes against a cold that never forgave. They came with hope stitched into every timber, fires burning bright behind walls of turf and stone. But one day, the footsteps faded, the doors swung open to nothing but drifting snow, and their voices slipped into the frost like secrets the wind still carries. So settle back, close your eyes if you haven't already, and let me take you there, into the vanished Viking settlements of Greenland, where houses stand empty under the endless white, and each step we follow disappears softly into the snow. Long before the world drew sharp borders on its maps, there was only the sea, wide and restless, its edges stitched with mist and dreams of new lands waiting beyond the reach of any known shore. The Vikings knew this hush well, the way wind tangled in the sail, the salt spray freezing on their cheeks as their longboats creaked through icy swells. They came to Greenland the way they came to every place they named, leaning forward into the cold, eyes fixed on a horizon blurred by drifting snow and the promise of fields no one else had claimed. Their boats landed on a coastline, jagged with stone and brittle grass that bent beneath their boots like old secrets. They stepped ashore with hands still rough from rowing, fur cloaks pulled tight against a wind that asked nothing and gave back less. They built small homes first, timber frames fitted together with turf packed thick along the walls, smoke rising through thatch into a sky pale enough to swallow the light by afternoon. Inside, fires cracked with the scent of driftwood and the low hum of voices that spoke of Norway and Iceland, of green fields remembered and cattle kept safe from wolves that prowled the edge of sleep. When the nights came early, they came heavy, The North Atlantic winds pressed against the doors like an old hand testing each latch. Children lay on straw beds near the hearth, listening to the gusts push snow against the walls, the hush of the storm mixing with the heartbeat of their mothers humming them into uneasy dreams. The first winters were the harshest. Cold deep enough to crack wooden beams, drifts so high they buried fences and turned paths into mazes that shifted overnight. Yet hope burned in small ways, tucked into the smell of fresh bread when grain ships found the shore, the creak of a new roof built stronger than the last, the laughter of men trading stories long after the sun dipped below the white hills. They called this place Brattahlid, Eastern Settlement, a name to anchor their courage in soil that thawed only long enough each year to promise hay for the cattle, roots for the stew, a garden patch green just long enough to remind them of home. Each stone laid into a wall was a vow whispered into the earth, a promise that this place, too, could hold life against the ice. Outside, the wind never stopped speaking. It carried flakes of snow across the roofs, slipped between the planks of stable doors, rattled the turf thatch, as if to remind each settler that Greenland, for all its fierce beauty, was a place that would not be tamed so easily. Yet in those first years, the Vikings dreamed as people do, of fires that would always stay warm, of fields that would grow generous each spring, of children who would know this white land as home long after the ships that brought them had rotted back into the sea. When spring finally came to Greenland, it came like a shy guest knocking at the edge of winter's long reign. The snow softened just enough to let green blades push through the earth, trembling in the breeze that still tasted of ice. The settlers stepped out from their turf houses, faces turned to the pale sun, hands testing the thawed ground where they hoped to coax barley and hay from soil that remembered more frost than warmth. Children chased each other across patches of muddy grass, their laughter caught in the wind that carried it down to the fjord, where the longboats bobbed like shadows waiting for another voyage. Mothers spread damp clothes on rocks warmed by sunlight, whispering prayers that the summer would last long enough to fatten the livestock, to fill the storage pits with enough to see them through another year. Inside the halls, men spoke of Norway and Iceland still, the shape of fields they once plowed, the taste of mead sweetened with honey that now lay far beyond the cold sea. Yet with each passing season, their words turned more often to Greenland itself, the way the hills curved soft around the settlement, the way the streams sang under drifting ice, promising water enough for cattle and grain. They built a small church near Brattahlid, walls of timber and stone, roof thatched tight against the rain that came suddenly, as if the sky itself remembered how to weep after so many months of silence. Inside, candles flickered against rough beams, the scent of tallow and pine mixing with the low murmur of prayers that rose like smoke to the rafters. Some nights, when the sun dipped behind the hills but never quite disappeared, the settlers would gather outside their houses, fires crackling against the hush of the fjord. They spoke of the day's small victories, a calf born healthy, a new fence that held against the wandering wind, a boat returned safely from the sea with fish enough to salt and store. They spoke softly, words drifting up to meet the slow swirl of mist that slipped between houses like an old friend who never stayed long. And when they lay down to sleep, they dreamed of roofs that would not leak, herds that would not thin under snow, hands that would build walls strong enough to stand against the storms that always came, sooner or later. Outside, the wind rattled loose turf, tugged at doors left cracked to let the hearth's warmth breathe out. The hush of Greenland pressed close around each small home, as if to remind those within that the land they claimed was still watching, still waiting to see who would stay when the cold returned. As the years turned slowly like the grinding of ice along the fjord, the settlers learned to read the land's quiet signs. They watched the color of the sky at dusk, the way the sea foam gathered along the rocks, the sudden hush in the gulls' cries. Before snow came earlier than it should, Greenland spoke in small ways, its voice hidden in drifts and cracks, in the thin line between a winter that could be survived and one that asked for more than a man could give. The turf houses stood firm through storms that rattled every door and window frame. Smoke rose from low chimneys, weaving into the white sky like threads of a prayer too old to name. Inside, the families gathered around hearths that popped and hissed, voices low as they mended tools, stirred pots of stew made thin by careful hands that knew how to stretch what little the land gave back. Children sat cross-legged near the fire, eyes wide as the oldest among them told stories of Norway's green valleys, of Iceland's volcanoes that roared like old gods, and of the first boats that had cut through the sea ice to find this place they now called home. They listened for the warmth in these tales, a warmth that flickered like the flames licking at the iron pot, trying to forget for a moment the wind that howled just beyond the turf walls. Out in the fields, fences leaned under the weight of drifting snow. Sheep huddled close in small stone pens, their breath rising in clouds that froze to their wool by dawn. Men took turns watching the herds at night, shoulders bent against gusts that bit through fur cloaks and stiffened their fingers around torches that burned low in the wind. When the sun returned, brief, pale, and slow to climb, it felt like a promise whispered too softly to trust completely. The grass turned green for just long enough to let the cattle graze, for the children to run barefoot between the sod houses, for women to dry fish on racks that caught the light and made them think, just for an afternoon, that Greenland's cold heart might be tamed after all. But in the quiet moments, they still wondered if the ships would return from Iceland with timber and grain, if the weather would hold steady enough to let the harvest grow tall before the frost slipped back down from the hills. They wondered if the walls they built each summer would stand through the next storm that always waited, patient as the snow that never truly left. And so each night they lay down, breath mixing with the hush inside the turf walls, dreams stitched together with prayers that the cold would not press too hard this time, that the small fires burning in Brattahlid's hearths would be enough to keep the dark at bay for one more season of driftwood, salted fish, and hope tucked under blankets thick with the scent of old smoke. More winters came and went. The people of Brattahlid learned to measure time by the sound of snow drifting off their roofs, the creak of turf walls settling under wind that rattled every latch. Some seasons were kinder than others, the sun lingering just long enough to tease patches of green from frozen earth, the fjord open enough to welcome ships that brought timber, grain, iron nails, and news of a world that felt as far away as the moon. When the ships did not come, the hush grew thicker inside their small halls. They whispered that the sea had turned against them, that the same cold water which carried their long boats across an ocean could keep them trapped, the ice building its walls just beyond the curve of the bay. At night, men gathered by the hearth, passing horns of thin ale from one rough hand to another, voices dropping low when the wind picked up and pressed its chill through every crack. Children listened with eyes wide, their small fingers tracing patterns in the frost that crept along the inside of window frames. They heard the grown-ups speak of dwindling timber, of ships trapped in the North Sea, of storms that swallowed more than they ever gave back. But when the stories turned dark, the old ones would shift the words, tell tales instead of the first landings, of strong boats and braver men, of feasts held when the fjord was clear and the meadows bright with grazing cattle. Outside, the barns groaned under snow that piled so high it seemed to press the roofs closer to the earth each year. Sheep huddled in stone pens, their bleats muffled by drifts that closed them in as if the land itself was trying to hush them. The cattle stood silent in stalls, layered thick with hay and old straw, their warm breath ghosting in beams of moonlight that slipped through narrow gaps in the timber walls. When spring did come, it came shy and thin. Women spread fish to dry on racks that leaned under the weight of the catch, praying the sun would stay just long enough to pull the dampness from each strip of flesh. Men walked the fields with eyes trained on the sky, counting the days until they could sow the barley that might yield enough for bread and ale if the ground agreed to stay soft. But Greenland's heart was never truly soft. It kept its hush pressed close, folding each new fence post and sod wall into the same snow that swallowed footprints before dawn. At night, inside the turf houses, families spoke of warmer lands, of Norway's hills, of Iceland's green edges, but the words felt thin, drifting away with the smoke that curled from the hearth and slipped into the dark, where it vanished among the endless white. And so they slept each night with the wind pressing close to the walls, dreams stitched together from small hopes that the ships would come again, that the sea would forgive, that the snow would give back the green for just one more year in this place they still dared to call home. As the seasons turned and the ice drifted deeper into the fjords, the longboats that once slipped through narrow channels came less and less. When a sail did appear on the horizon, families gathered on the rocks above the water, hands shielding their eyes from the sun that glittered on waves too cold to trust. They watched for the bright flags that might bring news from Iceland, Norway, or beyond. News of kin, of trade, of timber and iron nails to mend the boats that waited in silence along the shore. Some years, no sail came at all. The wind carried only the creak of drifting ice, the groan of distant bergs splitting under a sun that warmed nothing more than the tops of stones peeking through snow. Inside the turf houses, the hush grew thicker, a blanket that weighed down words before they could find the air. Men spoke softer around the hearth, voices catching in their beards, eyes turned to the flames as if they might find answers there. Women sat with their children tucked under furs, small hands busy with scraps of wool, spun into thread strong enough to stitch torn cloaks and patch sails that might never catch a sea wind again. The old ones told stories in these evenings. Tales of Eric the Red, of ships that sailed from Iceland to Greenland when the sea felt like a road, wide open and waiting. They spoke of feasts held when the first barns filled with grain and the cattle stood fat and warm in thick straw. But these stories felt softer now, as if the hush had worn their edges smooth, the way ice shapes stone. Outside, fences leaned harder each winter, their posts gnawed by frost that crept down from the hills. Sheep wandered closer to doors, where warmth escaped in thin ribbons through turf walls. Cattle lowed in stalls, where hay grew sparse by late winter. Men counting each bundle left in the loft, with a prayer that the grass would return before hunger pressed its teeth too deep. Sometimes, when the moon was thin and the sky clear enough to let starlight spill over snowdrifts, children said they saw shapes moving on the hill above the settlement, figures wrapped in fur, footsteps that left no trail by dawn. Their mothers hushed them back to sleep, smoothing hair damp with dreams, whispering that the only shadows here belonged to the wind and the memories it carried. And so the settlers lay awake more often, breath misting in the cold that found every crack. They wondered if the ships would return, if the sea would forgive, if the land they named home might still cradle their hopes beneath all this white. But Greenland gave no answers, only the hush that slipped under doors and the slow, soft drift of snow bearing fences, roofs, and the small footprints of children who dreamed of fields they would never see again. As the winters lengthened their grip, the people of the eastern settlement leaned harder into the hush that wrapped their turf houses each dusk. Fires burned longer through the night, a soft glow slipping through the low doorways, flickering across faces lined by wind and worry. Children curled close to the hearthstones, small shoulders tucked beneath wool blankets, listening to the crackle of driftwood that smelled faintly of the far shores it once touched. Men gathered near the door, boots propped by the threshold where snow blew in under the frame. They spoke in words that drifted like embers, questions asked in pieces, answers never quite spoken aloud. Some nights they stepped outside into the white hush, eyes scanning the dark hill where the wind bent the shadows of fence posts and half-buried stone walls. They looked for sails on the fjord, for lights where no lights should be, for signs that something raw or someone still moved in the drift beyond their reach. Inside, women mended cloaks by the fire's edge, needles slipping through wool with a rhythm that matched the hush pressing at the turf walls. They told the children to hush too, to hold their stories until morning, as if the dark itself might listen and carry secrets out into the snow. But the children still dreamed, of Norway's warm fields, of Iceland's hills that broke the wind, of longboats waiting at the shore, sails bright against a sky that promised spring. In the barns, cattle stood silent, breath steaming into beams of pale moonlight that found its way through gaps in the timbers. Sheep huddled close, their soft bleats muffled by the heavy drift that piled against the outer walls. Now and then, a man would break the hush, stepping into the frozen dark to check the fences, to run a gloved hand along the posts he could still find under the snow. And when he returned, boots crusted with ice, he would sit again by the hearth, eyes fixed on the flame as if the small crackle of fire might drown out the sound of wind pressing at every crack. They all knew the hush was patient, that Greenland asked not for sudden storms, but for slow silence, drifting in flake by flake, settling over fields that once promised green and now held nothing but white. Yet even in this cold, a stubborn hope lingered like an ember at the edge of the fire. They spoke of spring as if it might arrive on the next wind, soft and generous enough to melt the drifts, to loosen the earth, to carry ships once more through the ice-choked fjord. They spoke of children's voices filling the fields, of fences standing tall, of turf walls strong enough to hold back the hush that waited, always, just beyond the flame. And so they slept, breath slow, dreams stitched with the promise that come morning, the drift might pull back just enough to let them believe that the sea had not turned its back for good, that the land might yet remember how to stay warm. When spring returned, It did so shyly. A thin season, edges still sharp with frost, that clung to the corners of sod roofs and the ribs of the hills. The settlers stepped out from their turf houses, boots sinking into patches of mud where the snow had loosened its grip but never truly let go. They traced the streams as they thawed, bending low to watch clear water slip over stones, cold as the hush that waited in the shadow of every drift still piled along fence lines. Children ran for a little while, laughter trailing like ribbons behind them, feet bare on the first blades of green. Mothers called them back before the wind could steal the warmth from their small bones, gathering them close inside houses that smelled of damp earth, old smoke, and the soft hope that another growing season might be enough. Men walked the fields with eyes narrowed against the pale sun, hands pressed to the ground where they hoped to press seeds soon. They spoke less of feasts and more of the ships that never came, of the timber they could no longer count on, of the longboats that now lay half-buried where the shore met the ice, hulls splintering under the slow weight of seasons that cared nothing for old dreams. By the fjord, driftwood piled like bones bleached by a sun too weak to warm them. Some said it was a gift from the sea, a reminder that even Greenland, cold and proud, still offered what it could. Others gathered the wood in silence, hands raw from chopping pieces small enough to fit the hearths that waited to breathe them into flame. Inside the small church near Brattahlid, candles burned at dusk, their wax dripping slow onto stone floors worn smooth by knees that had bent so many times in prayer. The hush there was softer, like a hand pressed gently against a fevered brow. A promise, perhaps, that faith could stitch the frayed edge of a settlement held together by driftwood, fish bones, and the old stories carried in each heartbeat. When the sun dipped behind the hills and the first stars blinked awake in the thin night sky, the families gathered close by the hearth. They spoke of the summer to come, as if its warmth might fill the corners the wind could not reach. They spoke of calves strong enough to stand through the next snow, of gardens that might find root even when the ground threatened to freeze their hope beneath each tender shoot. And when sleep came, it came like the hush, drifting over tired shoulders, settling into straw beds, tucking itself around dreams where the ships still returned, sails wide with wind and cargo stacked high, with the promise that the sea could still carry them something more than stories of what once was. As the years wore on, the hush inside each turf house seemed to settle deeper than any drift of snow. The settlers grew quieter in their hope, voices lowering when they spoke of the ships that might never again slip through the ice-choked fjord, sails bright against a sky that once felt softer than this hard blue that hung above them now. Some mornings, they found fences buried in drifts that rose like walls overnight, sheep wandering loose, their hooves packed with frozen mud as they pressed close to doors where warmth escaped in slow ribbons. The men mended what they could, driving new stakes into ground that did not wish to open, hands raw from the cold that lived beneath the thawed crust of every field. Women gathered herbs when the sun held back the frost, long enough to coax green shoots from the stubborn soil. They dried small bundles above the hearth, tucking away the scent of summer in corners that the hush could not reach. Children, their cheeks flushed with wind, watched these careful hands, eyes wide as they learned which roots to dig and which prayers to say when the wind turned cruel too soon. In the church, the candles still burned each dusk, rows of flame flickering against stone that had learned to carry hope like an ember that refused to die, even when the wind rattled the turf roofs above. They sang hymns that drifted up into the rafters, voices soft but sure, echoing against the hush that pressed its ear close to every word. By the shore, old longboats lay half-sunk where the tide pushed and pulled them like toys left behind. Their hulls creaked when the wind swept across the fjord, a sound that made the children ask whether the sea might one day carry them home. Not the cold home of stone and driftwood, but the green hills of their fathers, the valleys where no snow buried fences overnight. Men traded fewer stories by the fire. Instead, they listened to the wind hum through gaps in the turf, to the pop of logs that smelled of salt and old journeys, to the hush that gathered at the threshold like an uninvited guest who had come to stay. They wondered if the land would ever give back what they had offered it: sweat, hope, prayers pressed into soil that remembered more ice than sun. When sleep came, it came like a drift of snow, soft at first, then heavy enough to press every thought into dreams where the fields stayed green just a little longer, where the cattle grew fat, where the sails finally rose on the horizon, full of wind that carried stories worth telling once more. Outside, the hush curled around each sod house, patient as ever, waiting to see which ember might flicker out first, and which might cling just long enough to warm a single room against the endless white. As more seasons folded into each other, the hush of Greenland's white breath drifted through every crack in the turf walls. Some families, tired of waiting for sails that never touched the horizon, packed what they could carry: a single chest, a carving of a cross, seeds wrapped in cloth, and turned their eyes back toward the sea that had once carried them here. No one spoke too loudly when they left. Their footsteps pressed into snow that closed behind them by morning, as if the land itself wished to keep their going quiet. The longboats that remained grew brittle under drifts, their ribs split by the push and pull of ice that pressed harder each spring. By the shore, old rope frayed in the salt wind, snapping softly when the tide rose high enough to tug at what the settlement could no longer mend. Inside the houses that stayed full, the fires burned lower now. Men sat longer by the hearth, eyes tracing the curve of beams blackened by years of smoke, ears tuned to the sound of the hush pushing at the turf walls, testing each seam like fingers searching for a loose thread. They spoke in shorter sentences, saving warmth for the breath needed to outlast the winter that always seemed to come too soon. The children, fewer now, played in the snow with smaller laughter. They built tiny fences from twigs, small barns from driftwood scraps, copying the world that faded slowly beyond their doorsteps. At night, they dreamed of fields they had never seen, of green so bright it glowed against their eyelids, of ships whose sails filled with wind that never tasted of ice. Mothers tucked them close, humming old hymns half-remembered, the words soft enough to keep the hush from stealing them away. They pressed herbs into small cloth bundles, hoping the warmth of the hearth would hold the cold at bay when the drifts rose past the windows, when the fences vanished into white. Out in the church, the candles flickered but did not fail, their flames dancing above floors worn smooth by prayers that asked only for one more spring, one more ship, one more promise that the land would not close its fist around the hope that kept each fire burning. The hush drifted through the rafters there too, settling into the corners like a question no one dared answer aloud. Sometimes, a man would stand at the edge of the settlement, looking across the fjord where the water moved under a thin skin of ice. He would listen for the creak of wood, the splash of an oar, the voice that might call from the dark and tell him that someone was coming back. But the wind answered first, carrying only the slow sigh of snow slipping from stone walls, the quiet confession that some footsteps fade without leaving even an echo behind. And so they slept, breath soft, dreams wrapped in blankets, heavy with the scent of old smoke, while the hush of Greenland pressed close, patient as always, waiting to see what would remain when the last footprints drifted away beneath the snow. When the last footsteps slipped away, they left so little behind that even the snow seemed unsure of where they had gone. The turf houses, once warm with the hum of voices, stood silent under drifts that pressed roofs closer to the earth each year. Inside, hearthstones cold to the touch held faint scars where fire once crackled bright enough to push back the hush that Greenland kept folded around its frozen heart. The church near Brattahlid leaned into the wind, its timbers groaning like an old man in restless sleep. Candles no longer burned behind its small windows, but sometimes, when the sun lay low and the sky turned pale as bone, travelers claimed they saw a flicker, a memory perhaps, or only the way light dances in a land that remembers what it cannot hold. No graves marked where they went. The stones they once stacked into fences now lay scattered, half buried under snow that drifted deeper each winter. Sheep pens collapsed into the earth, beams rotted by storms that blew in from the sea without knocking first. Longboats cracked apart on the fjord's edge, hulls split wide enough to let the tide slip through and carry splinters far beyond the bay. Yet the hush never forgot them. It wrapped itself around each stone wall, each broken door, each hearth where a mother once hummed her children to sleep as the wind rattled the turf above. It cradled the small stories, the green shoots coaxed from soil that never wanted to stay warm, the ships that came and went until they didn't, the dreams of fields too distant to touch. Some say the settlers sailed away when the ice turned the sea into a mirror too cruel to cross again. Others believe they folded themselves into the land, bones pressed into earth that refused to give back anything but cold silence. But the truth, like the hush, stayed patient, drifting between stone walls and snowdrifts, waiting for someone to ask the questions that no wind ever answered. If you stand by the ruins now, where the grass grows thin between fallen timbers and the air carries the salt of a sea still restless under the ice, you might hear it, the echo of footsteps pressed into snow, the creak of a door left ajar, the soft hush of a voice that promises spring will come, though the frost never forgets. And when you lie down to sleep, let this drift hold you the same way Greenland held them. Quiet, patient, wrapped in snow that keeps every secret close, until the hush is all that remains, carrying you deeper than any winter can reach, into a dream where footsteps never fade completely, but slip gentle into the wind. Thank you, my friends, for staying here with me and listening all the way to the end of this video. It means more than you know. This quiet corner we share, where old stories drift through the hush and your thoughts can breathe softer, even just for a while. I truly hope that tonight your mind feels lighter, your heartbeat calms, and any weight you've carried today slips away like footsteps into the snow. May stress loosen its hold, may sleep find you gently, and may tomorrow greet you kinder than today. If these whispers bring you comfort, please give this video a like and subscribe to this channel so you'll always have a place to come back to whenever the world feels too loud. And if you drift off before you know it, don't worry. Just leave me a little comment when you wake up so I know you were here and the stories kept you company. Sleep well, dream easy, and I can't wait to see you again in the next video.